She spat in the dirt. The young Japanese woman, once a field nurse in the wreckage of Okinawa, scoffed at the cowboy who held out a tray of food. "You call this war?" she muttered in her native tongue, loud enough for her comrades to hear. Laughter followed. The American guard, more ranch hand than soldier, just scratched his neck and walked away. His boots were clean, his voice was calm, too calm. She had survived bombings, starvation, and a regime that taught her pain was pride. Now she was being offered stew by a man who smelled like tobacco and horse leather. It made no sense. They mocked the cowboys behind closed barrack doors. Too soft, too slow, too kind. But days later, when the same cowboy handed her a bar of soap, a letter from her mother, and a harmonica, everything changed. The ridicule stopped. Because that's when she realized this wasn't softness. This was something her world had never truly shown her. This was dignity. The trucks rolled to a stop in a cloud of pale dust, engines ticking as they cooled beneath the Texas sun. For a moment, no one moved. The women inside sat stiffly, their backs straight, their eyes trained forward as if bracing for a blow that had yet to land. They had prepared themselves for humiliation, for shouting, for cruelty delivered with the casual confidence of victors. Instead, what greeted them was silence. Open land, a line of wooden buildings bleached by the sun, and men, American men, standing with their hats in their hands, not shouting, not rushing, simply waiting. The women descended one by one, their boots touched dry soil, and they felt it give slightly beneath them. The air smelled of grass and dust, not smoke or rot. No sirens wailed, no rifles were raised. The absence of menace was unsettling. One of the younger women laughed under her breath, a brittle sound meant to disguise her nerves. Another muttered, "This is it." Her voice carried disbelief more than fear. They had imagined chains. Instead, they were met with stillness. The cowboys, because that was what they looked like, with their worn hats and sunburned faces, kept a polite distance. Some nodded. One adjusted his belt. Another spat into the dirt and turned away, embarrassed by the stares. None of them looked triumphant. If anything, they looked unsure, as if they were unsure what to do with the fragile cargo that had just arrived. The women noticed this immediately. They had been taught that Americans reveled in humiliation. Yet here, no one laughed. As they were herded toward the long wooden bunkhouse, whispers rippled through the group. "Is this a joke?" one murmured. Another scoffed, louder, sharper. "This is what they call prison?" There was laughter then, thin, brittle, but defiant. It felt safer to mock the place than to admit how strange it all was. The buildings were clean, the ground was swept. Even the fences looked maintained, not the rusted cages of nightmare stories. Everything felt wrong in the quietest way. Inside the bunkhouse, rows of simple beds waited. Not bunks stacked to the ceiling, not bare floors, but actual frames with thin mattresses and folded blankets. The women stood frozen, uncertain whether to touch them. One finally reached out, brushed her fingers across a blanket, and flinched as if it might burn her. It didn't. It was just cloth. Ordinary, unremarkable cloth. That was what unsettled her the most. Behind them, an American soldier cleared his throat and gestured gently, motioning that they could sit. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. No barking orders, no threats. The women exchanged looks heavy with disbelief. This was not how prisoners were supposed to be received. This was not how enemies behaved. One of the girls laughed again, louder this time, the sound cracking as it escaped her chest. "They're soft," she whispered in Japanese, her eyes sweeping the room. They wouldn't last a day. Where we come from. A few others nodded, relief mixing with scorn. Mockery was easier than admitting confusion. Laughter was safer than gratitude. Yet beneath the bravado, something fragile stirred. A question none of them dared speak aloud. If this was softness, why did it feel heavier than fear? Outside, the sun dipped lower, painting the open fields gold. A breeze carried the smell of hay and distant livestock. No one shouted, no one hurried them. The guards simply waited, patient as stone. And in that stillness, the women felt the first unsettling crack in everything they thought they understood. They had arrived expecting cruelty. Instead, they were met with restraint, and that, somehow, was far more disarming. In training, restraint had never been mentioned. Pain was expected. Humiliation was promised. From the moment they were drafted into Japan's wartime auxiliary corps, the girls were fed a single, unbroken narrative. Surrender was not only shame, it was suicide by another name. If you lived to see the enemy, you had already failed. If you spoke their language, you had already betrayed your homeland. And if the Americans found you, they would break you, slowly, violently, completely. Kiyomi remembered the posters, ugly sketches of American soldiers with bloated faces and wide hands, dragging Japanese women into darkness. The officers at the training camp had pointed to those images like road signs. "This is your future," they said, "unless you are brave." That word, brave, meant different things in Japan. It did not mean survival. It meant silence, even in death. It meant swallowing your tongue before your captors could use your voice. The leaflets dropped from Allied planes were burned before the girls could read them. Anything with English letters was seen as poison. American voices on smuggled radios were turned off mid-sentence. No one ever explained why. They just said, "Better not to know what lies sound like." And yet, for all the warnings about cruelty from abroad, the worst pain often came from within their own ranks. In the hospital where Kiyomi was stationed, she had seen more bruises from superior officers than from enemy action. She had watched a boy, 16 maybe, bleed out on a cot while the surgeon smoked a cigarette and muttered, "He was weak." No one cried. Crying was weakness. Mercy was weakness. The girls were expected to clean blood from floors as if they were sweeping rice from a kitchen mat. They learned quickly not to ask questions. Kiyomi's mother had once told her, "You are not a person, you are a piece of the nation." At the time, she had nodded. She didn't know what else to do. When the war ended, it ended like a light, being switched off. No trumpets, no speeches, just silence. Officers vanished. Orders stopped. Radios went dead. Then came the trucks, the boats, the long line of girls and women being herded like cattle toward an unknown destination. For Kiyomi, the journey across the Pacific felt like a slow unraveling of certainty. Each day that passed without violence made the knot inside her tighten. This was the calm before a storm, surely. The Americans were only waiting to drop the mask. On the ship there were bunks, real mattresses, thin, yes, but clean. The food came on trays, not in slop buckets, not thrown to the floor, but passed hand to hand. One night they were given something warm, thick, and red. It smelled of garlic. Kiyomi had never smelled garlic like that before. She didn't eat it. She couldn't. Her stomach growled, but her brain whispered, "Poison, trick, trap." The guards said little, but their eyes didn't carry the look she had expected. No hunger, no rage, just boredom. Maybe. Routine. The kind of look you give to a job, not a conquest. She remembered one American soldier offering a second cup of coffee to the girl beside her. She refused. He nodded once and walked away. He didn't insist, That was what shook Kiyomi more than anything, the absence of force. Each day passed in quiet, sterile rhythms. No chains, no yelling, no mockery. It felt like a lie stretched so thin it might tear at any moment. But it never did. And by the time the ship reached the American coast, the women were too tired to be afraid. They stepped onto the docks with hollow eyes, waiting for the next chapter of cruelty that never came. And when the train finally reached Texas, when the doors slid open and the scent of hay and dust replaced the brine of the sea, something inside them hesitated. This wasn't the prison they had been promised. The monsters hadn't appeared, only cowboys squinting in the sunlight, only fences made of wood, only silence that wasn't threatening, but strange, almost gentle. It didn't feel like victory. But it didn't feel like war anymore either. It felt like the space between endings and beginnings, and none of them knew what to do with that. The next morning began not with shouting, but with a bell, low, metallic, and strangely calm. The women rose from their bunks slowly, unsure if they were meant to. For a moment, they just sat there in the half-light, wrapped in wool blankets that still smelled faintly of straw and starch. There were no guards banging on doors, no boots stomping, just the rustle of hay and the soft knock of morning air through the slats in the walls. Then it came, the smell. It drifted in on a current of wind like a ghost from another world, rich, salty, greasy, alive. It coiled through the barracks, punched through the fog of sleep, and landed in their stomachs with the force of a cannon. Bacon. The word didn't translate, but the scent did. It was overwhelming, obscene. One girl gasped and clutched her belly, as if the smell alone could undo her. Another covered her nose, her eyes wide with disbelief. The laughter from 2 days ago was gone. In its place was a silence that buzzed with memory and grief. They lined up slowly outside the mess hall. The sun was already hot. The guards stood nearby, rifles slung casually, their posture relaxed. Inside, the air was thick with heat and steam. Men in aprons, soldiers, cooks, both, worked at large iron griddles, flipping meat and stirring pans. One guard called out something in English, a gesture, a nod. The line moved forward. Trays were handed out, not tin cups, not buckets, real trays, and on them 2 slices of white bread, a scoop of soft eggs, fried potatoes, a mug of coffee, and, impossibly, 2 thick strips of bacon. The kind of food none of them had seen in years. The kind of food that, in Japan, had vanished with the first air raids. Kiyomi held her tray like it might bite. Her hands trembled. Her stomach clenched so tightly it hurt. She looked down at the glistening meat, the eggs still steaming, the bread soft as clouds. Her mind screamed, "This is a trick!" But her body screamed louder. She sat. Slowly, she lifted the fork. Slowly, she brought a bite of bacon to her mouth, and then salt, fat, heat, grease that coated her tongue and made her eyes water. She swallowed before she could think, and then she took another bite, then another. She chewed with the desperation of someone digging for something they lost long ago. By the time the plate was half empty, she realized she was crying. Not loud, not sobbing, just tears, hot and shameful, sliding down her cheeks like sweat. She tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Across from her, another woman gagged, stood up too fast, and vomited into a bucket by the wall. A guard handed her a rag and turned away. He didn't laugh. He didn't punish. He just kept standing there, quiet. That, somehow, was worse. The food wasn't just food, it was proof. Proof that the enemy didn't need to be cruel, that they had the resources to offer abundance, that they could choose kindness, not out of pity, but out of power. And that knowledge sat heavier in their bellies than the meal itself. Kiyomi forced herself to eat the rest. Every bite was a war between hunger and guilt. Her mother, if she was still alive, was boiling roots in Nagoya. Her younger cousin had been coughing blood the last time she saw him. What right did she have to eat this? What right did she have to live? When the meal ended, she stared at the empty tray. Her hands were still shaking. The guard passed by, collecting the dishes. For a second, their eyes met. He didn't smile. He just nodded, like it was nothing, like this was just breakfast. But for her, it was the first moment she truly understood. They had not only lost the war, they had lost the myth that made it worth fighting. And now the enemy was feeding them bacon, not to humiliate, not to bribe, just because they could. And that somehow made the shame burn even deeper. That night, as the moon hung low over the Texas plain, Kiyomi sat on her bunk and clutched the folded wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. She hadn't spoken all day. She hadn't needed to. Her silence, like the others, was no longer fear. It had become a kind of armor, a quiet wall she could hide behind while the world around her twisted into something unrecognizable. She didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the soft creaks of the wooden barracks settling into the night. In the next bed, one of the older women snored softly. A breeze passed through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere far off, a harmonica played. Kiyomi closed her eyes and tried to pretend it was the wind. The blanket was warm. Too warm. It smelled like detergent and fabric, not smoke or mold. And when the guard had handed it to her earlier that day, along with a small tin comb, a worn toothbrush, and a bar of soap, she had stared at the items like they were part of a riddle. She had taken them, nodded once, and walked back to her bunk. But the moment no one was looking, she shoved them under her mattress, not out of fear that someone would steal them, but out of disbelief. They couldn't possibly be hers. In her world, nothing was ever hers. Not the socks she wore in training, not the bandages she carried down hospital halls, not the food she spooned into her mouth with shaking hands. Everything had belonged to the Empire. Every act of survival was borrowed, conditional. But this comb, this brush, this blanket, they had been given freely. And she didn't know what to do with that. The next morning she woke to a knock on the wooden frame. A guard, tall, freckled, expression unreadable, stood holding a clipboard. He called a name, not hers, then another. Still not hers. Finally he looked up, hesitated, then said it. Kiyomi. She sat up, startled. Her name, not a number, not a rank. Her name. She raised a hand. The guard nodded, checked something off. Inspection, he said gently, gesturing toward the door. Outside, under the morning sun, the women stood in rows, not ordered, not barked at, just assembled. The guards moved down the line, checking hair, eyes, fingers. Bandages were replaced, coughs noted. One woman was given ointment for a rash on her hands. Another was handed a clean pair of socks. No one was hit. No one was shouted at. The inspections were methodical, almost dull. But the dullness was the strangest part of all. It meant they weren't being punished. They were being cared for. When it was her turn, Kiyomi flinched as the medic reached for her wrist. He paused, then adjusted his touch, softer. His fingers were warm. He checked her pulse, her eyes, the cut on her arm from the ship railing weeks earlier. It was healing. He didn't say anything, just nodded and scribbled on a chart. Then he looked her in the eye and said, "Okay." That single word echoed louder than any sermon she'd heard during war drills. Okay. She was okay. Back in the bunkhouse, she sat down on the edge of her bed. The blanket was still there. She reached beneath the mattress and pulled out the comb. It caught slightly on her tangled hair. She began to brush it out, slowly, gently, like she remembered her mother doing before the raid started. No one was watching. No one was filming her shame. It was just her hair, and the comb. Ownership had never been a feeling. It had been a rumor, a myth reserved for someone else's life. But here, in the quiet routine of an enemy camp, it arrived in the smallest things: a toothbrush, a name spoken aloud, a blanket folded by hand. And for the first time in years, Kiyomi let her hands rest in her lap, open, unguarded, no longer clenched around nothing. She didn't smile, not yet, but her grip had loosened, and that was something. The next week unfolded not like a sentence, but like a routine. That was the first thing Kiyomi noticed. There were rules, yes, but they were soft, almost breathable. Wake up at dawn, roll call, breakfast, chores, afternoon rest, evening supper, lights out. No one barked orders. No one carried a stick. The guards walked the grounds with slow steps and casual stances. Their rifles stayed slung, rarely raised. Some even whistled while they walked. That detail stuck with her. They whistled. Men who intended violence did not whistle. The camp still had fences, tall, with barbed wire strung like warning ribbons, but the wire had lost its menace. No one tried to run. There was nowhere to run to, and nowhere they wanted to run from. Inside, there were rows of bunkhouses, a mess hall, a small medical station, and a garden that someone had clearly cared for long before the women arrived. The land stretched wide, empty, and golden. Somewhere behind the kitchen there was even a chicken coop. One morning, a guard motioned toward the coop and said something in slow English. Then he held up a broom. He wasn't ordering, just offering. Kiyomi looked at him, then at the broom, then back at him. It took a moment to understand. He was asking if she wanted to help. She didn't answer. She just stepped forward and took the handle. Inside the coop, the smell was sharp, earthy. The chickens scattered, clucking with mild protest. Kiyomi began sweeping, not because she had to, but because it felt real, solid. There was something anchoring in the motion. She cleaned out the straw, refilled the water tins, scattered feed. Her hands remembered how to move with purpose. Her body remembered what it meant to work without dread in her throat. She stayed there longer than she needed to. Later that week, other tasks appeared: watering the garden, washing sheets, carrying supplies to the kitchen. Nothing harsh, nothing humiliating, no forced marches, no barking drills. Just needs that could be met. Needs that they could help with. One girl, Ayako, began humming while folding linens. Another told a joke in Japanese, and the laughter that followed didn't sound brittle. It sounded almost like it used to in the schoolyard before the sirens and the smoke. There was a shift happening. Small, invisible, but unmistakable. It lived in the way their shoulders sat lower, in the way they met each other's eyes, in the way they began to speak, not in fearful whispers, but in conversation. And then the whispers started. "What if we've been lied to?" Kiyomi heard it near the water pump one afternoon. Two younger women were rinsing socks and sharing memories of what they'd been taught: that Americans would torture them, that surrender was worse than death, that prisons would be filled with screams and smoke. And yet here, in this place labeled a prison, there were no screams, just chickens, gardens, bunkmates who slept through the night. The lie wasn't complete. The war had still burned their homes. The bombs had still fallen. The Americans were not saviors, but they were not the monsters either. And that truth, that fracture between ideology and experience, was growing wider each day. Kiyomi sat one evening outside the barracks, watching the horizon stretch into dust and sunset. A guard walked past and tipped his hat. She didn't flinch. He kept walking. In Japan, everything had been taken in the name of duty. Here, things were offered, not with kindness, perhaps, but with decency. And decency, she was starting to learn, could be more powerful than force. It still felt strange to call this place a prison. It had fences, but so did her childhood home. It had rules, but so did every village. And the men who watched her didn't leer. They nodded. That, somehow, made all the difference. This wasn't freedom, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something in between, soft, strange, and dangerous to believe in. But she was starting to believe in it anyway. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Kiyomi held it between her fingers as if it might vanish, or burn, or accuse her of something simply by existing. It was thin, pale, unmarked, ordinary in every way, except that it had been placed in her hands by the enemy. A pencil followed, laid gently on the table by a guard who did not speak. The room fell quiet, in a way that was different from silence. This was expectation. This was permission. No one told them what to write. No one warned them what not to say. The absence of instruction felt like a trap. Around her, other women stared at their blank pages, frozen. Some lowered their heads as if in prayer. Others held the pencil like a blade, unsure where to begin. Kiyomi stared at the paper until the whiteness began to ache. She had not written a letter in years. There had been no one to write to, or rather, no one left who could receive it. And yet, here it was, paper, ink, a chance to speak without shouting. Her hand trembled as she pressed the pencil down for the first time. She wrote her name. The act alone made her breath catch. The pencil scratched softly. It sounded loud in the quiet room, a sound she had forgotten, writing for someone, not for duty. She hesitated again, the point hovering above the page. What could she say? What was allowed? What would be taken from her if she told the truth? She thought of her mother's hands, red and cracked from washing clothes in cold water. She thought of the nights when the bombs shook the walls and the air smelled of burning rice and ash. She thought of the hunger that made her dizzy and the voice of the officer who told her to endure, always endure. And then she thought of the bacon, of the blanket, of the way the guard had said her name without mispronouncing it. Her hand moved. "I am alive," she wrote. The words looked foreign on the page, as if they belonged to someone else. She paused, then added more, slowly, carefully, afraid that if she went too fast, the truth might spill uncontrollably. "They feed us. They do not strike us. I am not afraid here." Her chest tightened. She stared at the sentence for a long time, waiting for guilt to arrive. It didn't. Instead, there was a strange sense of relief, as if a weight she'd been carrying since childhood had finally shifted. Around her, other pencils scratched softly. Some women wept as they wrote. Others stared at the page for minutes before daring to make a mark. A few folded their papers quickly, as if ashamed of what they had confessed. One girl wrote only her name and the word "alive" over and over, filling the page until there was no room left. When the letters were finished, a guard came through with a simple box. No inspection, no threats, just a quiet instruction: fold, seal, place inside. Kiyomi hesitated before dropping hers in. Once it left her hand, she felt a flicker of fear. That letter would travel where she could not. It would speak for her. It would carry her, truth, into a world that might not want to hear it. Days passed. Life in the camp continued its gentle rhythm. But something had shifted. The women walked differently now, straighter, quieter, as if some internal weight had been redistributed. The act of writing had done something that food and shelter could not. It had allowed them to name their experience, to give shape to what they had endured and what they were becoming. Far away, across oceans and borders, those letters would be opened by officials who expected bitterness, rage, or confession. Instead, they would find restraint, honesty, words that did not match the story they had told themselves. And in that quiet contradiction, a new unease would take root. For Kiyomi, the act of writing had changed something fundamental. She had spoken without being punished. She had told the truth and survived. And in that small, dangerous freedom, she felt the world shift. Not outwardly, but inside her chest. She folded her hands and waited. It began with steam, rising soft and fragrant from the wooden bathhouse like breath from another world. The guards said nothing that morning. They just opened the doors and motioned. Inside, basins were already filled. There were towels on pegs, and stacked in a neat pile at the edge of the room were bars of soap, wrapped in paper printed with cursive letters the women couldn't read. Kiyomi hesitated at the threshold. The last time she had bathed properly had been in a river, months before capture, while planes passed overhead. Before that, it had been buckets of cold water in a supply tent. Soap had been a myth, a memory. Someone behind her nudged forward. The door creaked wider. Warm air beckoned. She stepped inside. At first, no one spoke. There were no orders, no punishments for delay, just heat, water, and space. The women began undressing slowly, clinging to dignity, even as the bathhouse filled with the rustle of fabric and breath. Kiyomi moved to a corner and dipped her hands into the basin. It was hot, clean. Her body flinched at first, confused. Then it softened. The soap smelled like lemons. She picked up a bar with shaking hands. It slipped once, her palms too slick, her nerves too raw. But then she gripped it tighter and began to scrub. The first stroke brought tears, not from pain, not even from memory, but from something else, something deeper, buried. The sensation of her scalp under her own fingers, of warm water against lice-bitten skin. She hadn't realized how long she had gone without touching herself with care. Across the room, someone laughed. It was a startled sound, cut short like a hiccup. Another girl splashed her, and the room broke open. Not into chaos, but into something looser. Laughter, real laughter. Nervous at first, then freer. Buckets sloshed, hair was rinsed, soap passed hand to hand, and all around steam wrapped them like a second skin. For a moment the war did not live in their bones. Then came the music. First it sounded like a cat being strangled, then it found a rhythm. The women paused, necks craning toward the door. From somewhere outside, a banjo twanged off key. Someone, probably one of the cowboy guards, was playing, or trying to. The sound was absurd, ridiculous, oddly sweet. Then came the humming. Deep, nasal. A second cowboy joined in. The lyrics were in English, slurred and strange, something about a train or maybe a horse. The melody barely held together, but it didn't matter. Laughter erupted again, full, unrestrained. Not cruel, not mocking, just human. Someone whistled in response. Another slapped the water like a drum. Kiyomi leaned back, the soap still clutched in her hand, and let herself smile. Not out of joy, not yet, but out of disbelief. Out of the slow, seeping realization that something in her was loosening, something war had tried to seal shut. After the bath, the women wrapped themselves in towels and stepped outside, blinking at the sun. The guards didn't leer. They looked away, respectful. One of them waved awkwardly toward the bathhouse with a grin. The banjo sat beside him in the grass like a sleeping animal. That night, Kiyomi lay awake and listened. She didn't replay orders or screams or explosions. She replayed the banjo, the laughter, the way the soap smelled as it melted between her fingers. She remembered the sensation of clean skin and tangled hair drying in the heat. Her body no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like her own. The war had taken everything, but it had not taken this, the ability to laugh, to bathe, to feel absurd joy in the middle of humiliation and loss. And somehow that absurdity felt like a kind of freedom. It also felt like betrayal. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slow, quiet steps, through clean sheets, through gentle names spoken without scorn, through meals served without a stare of hatred. It arrived in laughter and in soap, and in the way a guard once stooped to pick up a dropped handkerchief and returned it with an embarrassed smile. And as these moments stacked like quiet stones, a question began to form, a question too dangerous to say out loud. If they treat us like we matter, why didn't our own? Kiyomi thought of the boys she had nursed back in Japan, their skin shredded from shrapnel, their eyes glazed with fever. She remembered the officers who scolded her for wasting bandages, the commander who slapped her when she wept. She remembered her father's silence the day she volunteered, and the way her mother looked away. In their world, dignity had come only through pain. Worth had been proven in how much one could endure without breaking. But here, it was given freely, not out of reverence, but recognition. The guards didn't worship them. They didn't fear them. They simply acknowledged them, as women, as people. It was unbearable. One afternoon, during a break from chores, a woman named Michiko whispered it aloud. "If the Americans think we're worth this much trouble, what does that mean for everything we believed?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Kiyomi stared at her hands. She wanted to shout, to deny it, to tell Michiko she was weak, dishonorable, confused. But she couldn't, because the same thought had taken root inside her, too. It was spreading like smoke through the dormitories, through the garden paths, through the minds of every woman who had ever bowed to a superior and swallowed her own rage. For so long they had been told their value came from loyalty, that women were the spine of the nation, meant to carry the weight of sacrifice without complaint. But here, in this strange, dusty prison camp, value looked different. It looked like a hot bath, like laughter, like a single pencil and a name called kindly in the morning. Loyalty had kept them alive, but it had also kept them silent. Now, in silence, they were beginning to listen to themselves. Some resisted the shift. They called it a trick, said the Americans were playing a game, softening them for some future cruelty. But cruelty never came. Only more banjo songs, more soap, more oddly polite guards who called them ma'am and tipped their hats. The facade never cracked, because it wasn't a facade. It was just how these men were, imperfect, absurd, but not monsters. Kiyomi's thoughts became treacherous. She began to replay old conversations, old beliefs. The word enemy started to wobble in her mouth. Not because the war had ended, it hadn't, but because her heart had. The enemy was no longer a shape, it was an idea, and that idea no longer held. Her people had prepared her to face torture. They had never prepared her to face kindness. That, she realized, was the more effective weapon. It made you question everything. One night she dreamed of her father. In the dream, he sat beside her on a porch, somewhere in Texas, perhaps. He said nothing, just stared into the horizon. And she, for the first time, wanted to ask him, "Why didn't we matter like this at home?" She woke up before he could answer. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was transformation, a painful one, but real. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? Please like the video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The girl's name was Haruka, and for most of her time in the camp, she moved like a shadow, quiet, obedient, unremarkable. She spoke when spoken to, did her chores without complaint, and wore the same expression every day, blank, unreadable. But something changed on a Wednesday afternoon when the rancher's daughter wandered past the garden fence with a small basket of pecans and a flash of color in her hand. The Americans called her Lizzie, maybe 10 or 11, with sunburned cheeks and calloused hands. She often walked the fence line, waving through the wire, curious but not cruel. That day, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, pink, delicate, a piece of cloth tied in a perfect bow. She held it out. Haruka stared, confused. A ribbon? It made no sense. There was no function, no utility. It didn't patch wounds or boil water. It didn't carry a message or hold down a tarp. It was beautiful, pointless, and perhaps for that reason the most dangerous thing she'd ever been offered. She didn't take it at first. She just looked at it, then at Lizzie, then back at the ribbon. The girl smiled and said something in English. Haruka didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. Lizzie pressed it into her palm gently and ran off before a guard could scold her. The fabric was soft, clean. It smelled faintly of lavender. That night, Haruka hid it under her pillow, afraid someone might take it, or worse, laugh. But in the morning, she did something unthinkable. She wore it. Her hands shook as she tied it into her hair, unsure if she remembered how. It had been so long since she'd cared about appearance. War had stripped away vanity, along with hunger and youth. But the ribbon sat there, a defiant splash of pink against black hair, glowing like a wound, and a declaration. In the mess hall, heads turned, not the guards, though one of them did glance up, confused, but the women. Some gasped, some smiled, one even stifled. A laugh, not cruel, but startled. Haruka kept her chin up. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize. For the first time in years, she felt seen. The effect was immediate. The next day, another girl used a scrap of red thread to tie back her braid. A week later, someone stitched a flower onto the hem of their blouse with a stolen needle and blue thread. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. Color was returning, not just to fabric, but to posture, to voices, to the quiet audacity of selfhood. It wasn't about rebellion, it wasn't about politics, it was about the rediscovery of identity in a world that had tried to erase it. In Japan, they had been told to become machines, clean, obedient, loyal. In captivity they were still numbers, but with a ribbon in her hair, Haruka was not a number. She was a girl, a person, alive. Kiyomi noticed it most in the mirrors, cracked and dirty, hanging in the corners of the washroom. For months, the women had barely looked at themselves. Now they lingered. Not out of vanity, but out of recognition. Beauty had become resistance, not in the way of boldness, but in the quiet insistence that they were still human, that the war had not stolen their softness, only buried it. The ribbon stayed in Haruka's hair for weeks. Eventually it faded, frayed at the edges, but it didn't matter. By then the shift had happened. The girls were smiling more, holding their heads higher, not because they were free, but because they had reclaimed something no captor, no nation, no ideology could give or take. The ribbon had reminded them. They were still there, and then, just like that, it was time to go. The announcement came without warning. One gray morning, a paper was pinned outside the mess hall, a list of names, some familiar, some forgotten. Next to each, an order. Prepare for transport. The war was over. Their country, broken and bruised, had signed the papers. The enemy was no longer the enemy. The girls were going home. They packed in silence. There wasn't much to take, just what they'd arrived with and what they'd slowly been given. A pair of boots, a bar of soap, a ribbon. One woman clutched a harmonica, a gift from a cowboy who'd taught her to play a tune she never quite mastered. Another carried a letter sealed in a small envelope, unsigned, with just 2 words scrawled in English. Be well. The morning of departure, the camp felt stiller than usual. No hammering from the stables, no banjo, just footsteps. Rows of guards stood quietly, backs straight, eyes forward. And there, at the gate, the cowboys waited, not in uniform but in their own clothes, wrinkled shirts, dusty boots, hats held over hearts. The girls stepped out one by one. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just nods, glances, gestures too small to name. A few hands shook. One man saluted. Another, overcome, muttered "good luck" under his breath. It was all they could give. No one laughed, not the girls, not the guards, not the Americans, because something had changed, something deeper than uniforms or borders or language. The laughter that had once shielded fear, that once mocked softness, was no longer necessary. In its place was something weightier. Respect. Haruka's ribbon was still in her hair. As they boarded the trucks, some of the women wept. Not loud sobs, but quiet ones, wells of emotion too full to contain. Kiyomi sat beside Michiko and stared at the landscape rolling past. The fences, the trees, the bunkhouses that had held them not as prisoners, but as people. They had come to this place with nothing, not just physically, but spiritually. They had been taught that their worth was in suffering, in silence, in sacrifice. But here, of all places, here, in the enemy's land, they had learned something else. They had been valued, and in being valued, they had begun to value themselves. Their bodies had changed, their faces were fuller, their skin no longer clung to bone. But it wasn't the weight that mattered. It was what it carried. A new understanding, a quiet rebellion, a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, yet impossible to forget. Dignity is not weakness. Kindness is not cowardice. And sometimes the softest touch leaves the deepest mark. Back in Japan, the reception was cold, suspicious. These were women who had lived among the enemy, smiled at them, written letters, worn their gifts. Some families refused to take them back. Others welcomed them, but with wary eyes. The girls said little. What could they say? But in the years that followed, they wrote. Some published memoirs. Others shared stories only with grandchildren. Some never spoke of it again, but kept the ribbon in a drawer, or the harmonica on a shelf, or the soap's scent buried in memory. Not for nostalgia, but for truth. They had survived. But more than that, they had changed. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering this piece of history the world nearly forgot.